Hey, so we're going to continue our study of the Republic now, reading some of the really important material from Book 6 and a little bit of Book 7. And this is going to be where our study is going to end. So we're really, what we're going to do is going to be to focus on an image Socrates uses to talk about our experience at the end of Book 6, which is the image of a divided line. That's our real focus now. But we're also going to talk about the image of the cave, very famous image that he uses at the beginning of Book 7. Um, and I'll just mention, I talked last time about the sort of ambivalent meaning to the word end, and I'll begin by noting that at 506D in Book 6, Glaucon says, he says, Socrates, you've got to talk about this. And Socrates says, I don't know, it's a bit tough. And Glaucon says, you're not going to withdraw when you are, as it were, at the end. Right? So that's at 506D. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the presence in the text of that issue I was raising before. Anyway, what I want to start by talking about is, I want to start at 507B, where the conversation picks up pretty directly from where we left it off at the end of Book 5. So at 507B, Socrates said, okay, remember this, we distinguish in speech many fair things, many good things, and so on for each kind of thing. Right? We distinguish many fair things, many good things, right? But on the other hand, we also assert that there is fair itself. Again, fair is the word kalon, which might more naturally be translated beauty here. So there is beauty itself, auta to kalon, a good itself, auta to agathon, and so on, for each of those kinds of things that we then set down as many, right? And that was, the many are how those ideas of beauty or goodness or whatever, he says, we see in communion with bodies and actions and each other and so on. Community with, I think. Anyway, he says, so now again we refer to them, in a translation it says to one idea. I mean, that's basically just a transliteration of the Greek word. It's not a translation exactly. So he hasn't really said what the Greek word idea means, and I'll just leave it that way. But the only thing I'll say is, it doesn't mean an idea in your head the way it does in English. So it's kind of an unhelpful word to leave untranslated. But anyway, so now again we refer to one idea of each as though the idea were one. And we address it as what really is. Anyway, you should recognize in that material from 507B that I just read, basically just a repetition of the stuff we were talking about last time in more detail at the end of Book 5. So that's just conjuring that up for us again. So now we get on to the point, right? He says, moreover, we say that the former are seen but not intellected, while the ideas are intellected but not seen. Okay, the former are things like the many beautiful things. The latter is something like beauty itself, beauty as such, And he says, you see beautiful things. But you don't see beauty as such. He says here, in this translation, you intellect it. So that's the thing I want to talk about. So the words here, the noun for seeing is horastai, just a version of see. The noun for he's translating intellect here as a verb to intellect it or to understand it intelligently or something like that is noestai, which is a version of that same noun and verb pair we looked at a long time ago in the very first lecture actually, and that was the verb noein and the noun nous. And I said at the time, nous you can translate as mind, intellect, various things. All of these translations carry with them a lot of baggage, so you got to be a little careful about just translating one word with another word and then importing all of your presumptions about that word into it. So yeah, mind or intellect we could use, but then we got to think about just exactly what that means. Anyway, the thing I really want to draw your attention to is that he's saying, when we grasp beauty itself, when we recognize goodness itself, the good itself, or anything like that, the word he wants to use for that recognition is some version of knowing, that word we talked about with Heraclitus and Parmenides. So let me just remind you a little bit about what that was, right? Knowing was really the word we used for grasping reality on its own terms, reality as such, which is where our study began, right? And the idea there that I was really trying to stress, the idea I was trying to stress was that seems to be kind of a unique thing about us. I mean, as far as I know, nothing else does it. Maybe something else does, but we don't run into other things that do that. We don't run into other things that can understand the Pythagorean theorem, right? That the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the sum of the other two sides, and so on. So that, with our study of the pre-Socratics, we were emphasizing the way that kind of cognition, that kind of recognizing of the world that we're associating with the word knowing, was grasping things like mathematical truths, the mathematical structure of music, or the Pythagorean theorem, the mathematical structure of space, right? But the point about those things is when you grasp the Pythagorean theorem, you're not looking at any particular triangle. You're looking at what's true of the triangles as such. So you're grasping it kind of in absolute terms. That's the thing about nous, right? It's grasping things in absolute terms, which doesn't seem like anything else really does. And again, so that's why, I can look out my street and see a house over there and so on. But there, I'm just seeing a bunch of stuff. I don't really grasp what I'm seeing for what it really is until I recognize, oh, that's reality I'm seeing there. That's so many different ways reality is appearing, right? And as Heraclitus says, changing, it rests, right? So in other words, through no matter what changes I see, what's really presenting itself to me is the real. And I can recognize that. We all can recognize that. Presumably you've done that. If you're in this course, you did it a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago. So now the issue is, what was that recognition? Was that seeing? Well, it didn't happen somewhere else than in your seeing. You didn't go to a different place. You never stopped seeing, and you're not talking about anything other than what you were seeing. But it's not simply the same activity or the same kind of recognition as that visual noticing that there is a house there and so on, right? So the knowing it almost sounds like the English knowing, and they almost mean the same thing in some respect. But anyway, knowing, the Greek word, is what I'm saying. Knowing is recognizing what presents itself sensibly to you in terms of its kind of absolute character, right? So seeing it in terms of the way, the very nature of reality as such is being presented to you, right? And that's what we did. Simply in using the word reality, you've already done that, right? If that word makes sense to you, if the word is, which is just another version of saying real, right? If the word is makes sense of you, and presumably it does because you use it in virtually every sentence you speak, that means you have, whether you've ever explicitly noticed it or not, which you probably wouldn't do unless you took a philosophy class, I guess, but whether you've explicitly noticed it or not, you were in a way always at some level recognizing or engaging with this thing as real. You're using that notion of the real as such every time you talk and say is, right? But so you do it explicitly when you say, oh, reality, because you don't mean this or that particular thing. You mean, that ultimate context of what's actually really happening, right? So I'm just reiterating the stuff I said in that very first lecture. But I'm trying to bring it back to your mind now to get you to reconnect with that distinction, right? The idea that in the same basic act of experiencing, you can either notice the house across the street or you can notice that reality is happening, right? Well, so in a similar kind of way, you can either be absorbed in how beautiful something is, like you get wrapped up in enjoying the beauty of some beautiful thing, or you can, in that context, recognize the fact of beauty. And you could be a person who becomes interested in beauty rather than just enjoying this beautiful thing, right? Similarly, you can become interested in justice. You can make justice an issue for yourself and try to understand what justice is, what justice as such is, rather than just being like whenever you're angry, you're thinking of this notion of thumos that we talked about. Whenever you're angry, you're sort of wrapped up in experiencing yourself as having had injustice done to you. But what you're thinking about is how mad you are at that other person. You want to punch them back. So you're living out an experience of injustice, but you're not reflecting on what is justice, right? But you could, because there is something revealed to you in your anger that that is this profound meaning, the very issue of justice, and you could take that issue up on its own terms, right? But if you do that, you're doing something other than just being wrapped up in the immediate way things present themselves to you perceptually, and you're asking yourself, okay, what is it that is happening in this ongoing coming into being and passing away of perceptual life, and asking what's really happening there, or thinking again, Heraclitus saying changing at rest. You're asking, in all this changing, what's resting? What remains the same? Anyway, and that is the recognition of things like beauty as such, the good as such, justice as such, inasmuch as those have shown themselves in our experience to be the very parameters of reality, dimensions of reality as such. So, in a way then, more than in a way, pretty directly, talking about beauty as such, the good itself, etc., is a version of that same thing as talking about the Pythagorean theorem, right? When we talked about Pythagoras, we tried to talk about the way we were discovering something about the very structure of reality. And that took a kind of mathematical form. Well, as I said before, what Socrates, it seems to me, is doing is saying, yeah, we can continue that same line of investigation and see these actually kind of more exciting things that are the structures of reality: beauty, the good, and so on. And as I said, the point I wanted to get here is, again, just reiterating what came before, but you need to bring it back to mind and hold on to it. Reiterating then this idea that to grasp yourself as having beauty itself put on display before you, or is a different kind of experiential relationship to what you're dealing with than just seeing a beautiful thing, right? You're still seeing that beautiful thing, but in your seeing of that beautiful thing, you're doing something further, which is you are recognizing it as the appearing of beauty as such, the appearing of beauty. So you're not just seeing the thing as beautiful, you're seeing beauty showing itself, presenting itself through the thing, something like that. So that, it seems to me, is a very powerful distinction, and a really important one, a really profound one. That's one of the biggest thoughts you'll ever think. You can work on that for the rest of your life. And that's so much of philosophy is wrapped up in there, but so much of Plato especially is wrapped up in exploring that what is involved in those kinds of experiences that we have. I want to make one more point, just to complete this, and then we can move on. I want to remind you then of another thing that we said at the end of chapter 5, book 5. We talked about then, when we looked at the relationship between the many beautiful things, for example, and beauty, right? We talked about that in terms of a power. We talked about beauty as a kind of power, or a kind of cause. And I want you, and I want just to remind you of that point again as I say something else. So, we're talking about beautiful things, and recognizing, not just getting wrapped up in the thing, but seeing it as the presentation of beauty and so on. I want you to think about something similar. Let me clarify what I'm saying. The point is, when you're seeing a beautiful thing, you're doing that because you're the kind of being that can relate to beauty as such. But your attention is not on that. You're sort of enjoying the effects of beauty as such, without orienting yourself towards noticing that the cause or the source of that. And so, what Socrates is doing in all these things is trying to get you to look at your own experience and recognize that there are things that are going on there that you haven't acknowledged. Again, that was our theme from the beginning with Heraclitus, right? Eyes and ears are bad witnesses to barbarian souls, something like that. In other words, there's stuff going on in your experience, but you really misunderstand what you're seeing. I think he says something like, being awake, you're like someone sleeping, because you even though something is really happening in your experience, you're not noticing it. You're not being attuned to it. So there is a kind of change you can make in your experience where you have to orient yourself away from those things that you were wrapped up in this immediate gripping way. You have to orient yourself away from that and sort of turn and notice that you're having that experience and ask, what's going on in this? And recognize something else is making it possible for you to have that experience. So in other words, in that experience, something else is showing itself. Something shows itself through what you more normally notice, what more normally is showing to you, right? A house is sort of showing itself to you perceptually, but in the perceptual showing of the house, reality is also showing itself, right? Something like that. So as I said, the thing I'm trying to get you to notice is this very important difference between two different, let's say, kinds of knowing, and that's correlated, that's paired up with what we might call two different objects or two different whats. You're still seeing the same thing, but now you're seeing it as reality. You're seeing it as the showing of reality. You're not seeing it as the house. Nothing else is happening in your perception. You didn't suddenly, it's not like a new thing popped up. You're still looking at exactly the same situation, but you're seeing something through what you were noticing before, right? So that's what I mean when I say there are two different objects. It means the way you're construing this thing is kind of different, right? And that should remind you of this remark I made about the forest and the trees, right? When you see the forest or you see the trees, in a way you're seeing exactly the same thing. But at a certain point you recognize, oh, I'm in a forest, right? And so the same perceptual experience of the multiplicity of trees becomes the recognition of the single reality of the forest that's presenting itself throughout, right? So something similar is happening. And you would say the trees and the forest are in a way a different object. It's not like you're seeing a materially different thing. It's that what you're seeing it as is different, right? So that's the thing I'm trying to get out of here. The important difference in this situation between these two different ways of seeing. As I said, I want to bring it back to another example so you can see how pervasive that is and notice where you might have been a barbarian soul a little bit. If I should have brought one with me. I'll put a picture up, I guess. But if you think of what you would normally call a seed, right? If you saw one, like I don't know, maybe someone was eating oranges and they left their orange seeds on the table, and you came into that room and you said, "Oh, what's that?" And you'd say, "Oh, it's an orange seed," right? You might have thought that you just see an orange seed. But in the same way that we've just been talking about with these other examples, it's actually a little deeper than that, right? Because think about what the word seed means. Seed means something that will grow into a full-grown plant, right? Something that is sort of fertile with or pregnant with further life, such that if you put it in the soil and give it some heat and give it some water, something's going to spring out of it, right? So to call something a seed isn't just to observe kind of what's factually present in front of you. To see something as a seed is to see in that factually present thing a power. It's to see a kind of future that is in fact not factually present yet, not available in any sensory way or in any other way. It doesn't even exist yet in any realized sense. But you see in that thing that it is going to go somewhere, as long as you don't, if you give it what it needs and don't hinder its growth. If you just give it its natural conditions of dirt and light and water, that's what is going to happen. So in the seed, you actually see a power of growth. And that's what you're naming when you say seed. So you could, I guess, if to describe it in more perceptual terms, you might, sort of duller terms, you might say, "Oh, I see some little sort of ovalish kind of whitish things down there," right? Actually, and then if I guess that is what happens. You see these little ovalish whitish things on the table, and you say, "What's that?" And you say, "Oh, they're seeds." Well, think about the move between those two. The move between those two wasn't getting some new sensory feature. It was recognizing those things as the presence of a kind of power, the power to grow into an orange plant, right? And it's only because you're the kind of being that can recognize powers that you can have such a thing as a concept of a seed, and that you could see that white egg-shaped thing, oval thing. I guess egg is funny. It's funny that word actually means seed, more or less. Anyway, that white oval, and oval is just a word from egg, like ovum. Seeing that oval-shaped thing and seeing it as a seed, right? That's only possible because you're the kind of being who can recognize powers, right? So the point I was trying to get at there is that in something as everyday as your immediate recognition of something as a seed, you have already been drawing on your ability to meaningfully recognize things much richer and deeper than is simply presented to you kind of in a sensory perceptual way. So in the same way that in beautiful things, there is already implicit the possibility for you to turn around and attend to beauty itself, because you are already implicitly kind of channeling it. Your experience is already being illuminated by being itself. So you could turn away from what is illuminated and attend to what is illuminating, right? And that would be that, that would be that using that other kind of cognition, knowing or something like that. In the same way, in the seed, you can move away from your immediate perceptual recognition of a seed to the explicit recognition of what is already implicitly illuminating that, namely your grasp of something like life, the power that is life, right? So, when you go to the garden store, you're just looking for seeds. And that's kind of like when you're erotically charged up, you look for beautiful bodies, there you relate to those things, but you just deal with them in terms of your sort of immediate practical desires and feelings and so on. But in that experience of beautiful bodies, or in that experience of the seeds you go to buy at the gardening center to plant, there is the possibility of you changing your perspective and noticing something about the character of reality, right? What it is about the character of reality that is already illuminating your experience, such that you can have an erotic relationship to a beautiful body, or a gardener's relationship to a seed. But notice also that when you make that move, you're no longer trying to pick up that beautiful person or garden. You can still do that, but you have taken yourself out of the practical relationship and turned your attention to what we could call a kind of contemplative relationship. Like you're turning your attention to saying, "Oh, what is the nature of reality?" That doesn't mean it's bad to garden. Doesn't mean it's bad to be erotically charged up about beautiful bodies and so on. It's just that the relationship to beauty itself, the experiential orientation towards that is different from trying to pick this person up or do things with that person. And the experiential orientation towards the recognition of the very nature of life is different from planting seeds. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to get to. It's funny, there's a lot packed into that one sentence. Moreover, we say that the former are seen but not intellected, while the ideas are intellected but not seen. But that is, there's a lot in that, and it's very important. It's very powerful, and I've tried to explain that sentence. As I said, it just picks up on those two lines before that connected us with the end of Book 5. So now we're going to go on and read a little bit more, and we're going to make our way into, we're going to pick up on this theme of illumination, and we're going to make our way to the good, and then to the divided line. So anyway, so Socrates then goes on to talk a bit more about this, what's going on in our everyday perceptual experience. And he's going to make a point very similar to what I've already made in explaining that distinction between horasthai and noesthai. But but he does it a little bit differently. So he first asks Glaucon at 507 C and D. He says, consider it this way. Is there a need for another class of thing in addition to hearing and sound in order that the one hear and the other be heard? Is there, in other words, a third thing in the absence of which the one won't hear and the other won't be heard? And Glaucon says no. That doesn't seem like a very good answer to me. I don't think there's any hearing unless you got an ear. I don't think there's any hearing unless there's some body that produces that sound. I don't think there's any hearing if that ear isn't part of a living organism. I don't think there's any hearing if that body that produces the sound isn't part of the larger fabric of reality. I don't think there's any hearing if there isn't an intervening medium of air that moves with the sound. So Glaucon's answer, which is an answer probably that many of us would give automatically, like what's hearing? Isn't hearing just hearing a sound? Isn't it just those two things? His answer, as I said, which many of us would give, doesn't really think very deeply about what has to be in place for that hearing of a sound to happen and to work. So, as I said, there are probably lots of answers one could have given to different kinds of things that are essential, in addition to the hearing and the sound exactly. But Glaucon doesn't think of any of them. Anyway, but he just says no. And so Socrates then goes on to say, well, this is about near the end of D. He says, well, don't you notice that the power of seeing and what's seen have such a need for another thing? And Glaucon says, how? Well, he says, well, surely when sight is in the eyes and the man possessing them tries to make use of it. Okay, so Socrates has already subtly put in the eyes and the person, which is both the organic body and the psychic reality of the man. So already in saying that first sentence, he's done the same thing I did. He's pointed out a couple of things Glaucon missed, but that's not what he's going to focus on. So he says, surely when sight is in the eyes and the man possessing them tries to make use of it, and color is present in what is to be seen. Well, there's color, there's what is to be seen. So he's filled it out on both sides. But then he says, still, in the absence of a third class of thing, a different kind of thing than any of that, a different kind of thing, in the absence of a third class of thing whose nature is specifically directed to this very purpose, you know that sight will see nothing and colors will be unseen. So he says, yeah, there's another one, an even more important one, that is integral to this whole thing, without which there is no seeing. And Glaucon says, what class of thing are you speaking of? And Socrates says, light. Well, that seems like a great answer, right? That if you think about seeing and being seen, you can have all the power of sight you like in your eye. And there can be as colorful and as seeable an object as you like. But if it's completely dark in the room, you won't see anything. But as soon as that whole situation is illuminated by light, then you see. Right? So that's the third kind of thing that has to be there, illumination. They talk about that for a while. They talk about it in terms of, he says, which of the lords in heaven is responsible for this? And Glaucon answers, the sun. So Socrates doesn't really pursue that, but who knows exactly what Socrates thought about that? Who knows what those lords in heaven mean exactly? Like, you might remember the accusation in the court, in the apology, that Socrates doesn't think that the sun is a god. And Socrates doesn't hear say that. He says the lords in heaven. So he invokes that kind of language. But he doesn't say, I think I'm the god. And he doesn't even say that that's the kind of thing he means. He just says which one, you know. And Glaucon identifies the sun. And Glaucon very well might believe that that's a certain kind of god. So anyway, that issue is raised. What Socrates thinks about that and how he would have handled that set of questions and issues, we don't know. But anyway, that's raised. That's just an aside. Let me get back to light, though. Well, so anyway, let me just talk about it. So yeah, so the important point there is that light illuminates these things, and in the context of that illumination, the relationship between these two things becomes possible. So typically, you only notice the thing you see, like, oh, there's my pre-Socratics reader book. You know, I see the object. I, in fact, can only see it because of the light. But I see that. But there's something I can do, right? I can, in that context, do the same thing I was saying before, turn around and notice the light. Now, I don't notice the light really in any way other than seeing illuminated bodies, right? But in seeing those illuminated bodies, I can sort of focus on the illumination as opposed to the body. And so that is the thing he makes explicit here is the image, or the language I was using before when I was talking about beauty as such illuminating, your relationship to something, or the good as such illuminating your relationship to something. And that's exactly what he's going to say. So at 508, I guess, E, he says, therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. And as the cause of knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known. But as far as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that the good is actually something different from them and still fairer, more beautiful than they, then your belief will be right. Partially he's answering the question earlier when we might go back and mention this. He's talking with Glaucon and say, some people think the good is pleasure, some people think it's knowledge. And Glaucon says, do you think it's something beyond those? And here's his answer. He says, yeah, something beyond those. It's, in a way, it makes those things good, but those things are not themselves the good. But anyway, so the relevant point I want to make here is that he's saying, just as you have to illuminate seer and seen, you also have to, in a kind of analogous way, illuminate knower and known. And that is essentially what the good does. It's what illuminates that most basic relationship in which we know the truth of things. In a way, he's trying to put it a kind of a level behind the sun, you might say. Or actually, I can put it this way. I said before, when we were talking about the pre-Socratics and Socrates, I said that Socrates was going to carry on with that notion of reality, but emphasize that, bring out the notion of the good as what we have to recognize about the very structure of reality. And that's kind of what he's saying here. That's the idea that lies behind all truth, and therefore, in a way, lies behind all being, all reality. We'll try to explain a little bit more why that might be so. But I first want you just to understand, the relationship he's pointing to. So then he says further down at 509b, so he says, therefore, say that not only being known is present in the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them, besides as a result of it. That's the thing I was just trying to say. So he's saying that this is responsible for the very fact that things are, not just for the fact that things are known. So another way of saying that is the good he's saying is really the ultimate cause, the ultimate reason for reality. And that should remind you then of this point I was making in Book 2, when Adeimantus shaped the conversation to the point that they agreed that the good was only cause of the bad things, or the good things, not the bad things. Here, Socrates makes it clear the good is cause of everything. And then he says also this other point I made. He says, because it is the cause of existence being, then also you have to recognize that the good itself isn't being, but is still beyond being. And I mentioned that in Book 2 as well, because there also they in their conversation they emphasize that the good was being. And here Socrates, when he talks about about the good, makes it clear that he is maintaining something that is at odds with the points that they followed out because of what Adeimantus said. In any case, so that's about comparing them. But in any case, I just want you to think about what's being said about the good, right? He's saying the good as such is really the ultimate reason for everything. Things exist for the sake of the good. It's good that there should be things. That's why there are things. I will just mention that and get you to think about that as the idea that the good is the cause of things and illuminates our experience of things and so on. I want to go back to another passage about the good. And this now, here, this is they've been having a conversation, and this starts at around 503b, 503b. And this is now picking up on the conversation again from the end of Book 5, where they were talking about philosophy and political power had to come together in the same place for there to be a good human situation. Otherwise, there will be no end of ills in the city, right? If philosophy and political power don't coincide. And that's what led them then to ask, well, who's the philosopher, and so on. So that's what they're talking about here. And that's the thing that's often people these guys talk about it in a kind of shorthand, and other people, scholars and commentators, produce a caricature of this when they talk about philosopher kings. But so here's the but I've been trying to talk about what, how we have to maintain carefully what that means. And I was saying, we have to really think about this as meaning the guardian in the precise sense, which is an expression Thrasymachus introduced in Book 1, and the philosopher in the precise sense. And he's been arguing that those two must come together, and he says that very explicitly. He reminds us of that very explicitly at 503b. So let's now dare to say this: philosophers must be established as the most precise guardians in the most precise sense. Well, of course, that's exactly what we've already said. So now they're going to continue with that. He says, there probably aren't going to be that many, and the actual discussion here is pretty interesting. He says, and it repeats things we've seen before. He says, what it takes to be a philosopher is you actually have to hold together things in your soul that tend to go apart. So he says, on the one hand, you need people who are good at learning and very open, but he says people like that can be kind of unstable. And he says, on the other hand, you can have really stable people, but they tend to be kind of closed-minded and so on. So that's at 503 C and D. Just that opposition there is a really good one. It should remind you of a couple of the oppositions we saw before. Just a little bit earlier in Book 6, we referred to the two, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Book 4, but it just comes up a few pages before this. He talks about what people generally think of as philosophers, either those sort of wimpy people, sucky, soft people whose heads are up in the clouds, or those vicious people who use argument to take advantage of other people, right? So there were two things that sort of masquerade as philosophers, but they're not really it. Here again, you're seeing the two vices in a way, that the things that would have to go into the good philosophical nature, the two vices are often led to, because you either get this one in excess or that one in excess. And this should be, and again, it should remind you of Book 3, when we talked about musical and gymnastic education, and we talked about what comes if you get too much gymnastic, and what comes if you get without music, and what comes if you get too much music without gymnastic. You either get savagery in the case of too much gymnastic without music, or certain kind of softness, as I recall, if you get too much music without gymnastic. So there in Book 3, and then in our discussion of the two things that masquerade as philosophers nowadays, and then here in his talk about the two things that have to come together in a philosophical soul that tend to go apart. In all of those, you should see, I think, pretty parallel and insightful discussions of, what goes into making up a kind of well-developed soul, right? A well-developed character. But anyway, the thing he's really getting at here that I think is quite interesting is that there are these two sides in us that tend to go in other opposite directions. Like, we both need to be open and closed. So to speak, right? The thing that's interesting, especially interesting about the way he talks about it here, is in emphasizing that these very things that have to go into the philosophical nature are on their own naturally opposed. And so what the philosopher is going to have to be someone who is kind of unified two things that are naturally opposed. Well, that should remind you of Heraclitus's notion of the back-turning harmony, right? Differing with itself, it agrees with itself. And this was a point I made about Socrates in contrast to Cephalus, that he kind of lives out of a kind of tension. He's always charged up, and I used the notion of the palanthropos harmony to talk about him in contrast to Cephalus as something like the posset that will settle if you don't stir it up. But Socrates doesn't need any stirring up. He's got that tension inside himself already. Well, right here you get this very interesting, basically, description of why the philosopher has to be a kind of palinthropos harmonia, a back-turning harmony, because it's got to be a single unified nature that comes from holding together two tendencies in the soul that would otherwise take you in different directions. So that's really quite interesting. So I'm not going to pursue that, although that you can pursue that in connection with those other parallel passages I referred to. But I wanted to refer to it explicitly here to bring out the parallels, but also especially to be able to emphasize that notion of the palinthropos harmoniae that comes up here. Anyway, the thing I wanted to emphasize comes up a little bit later. They say, okay, who's this philosopher going to be? Well, he's going to have to study the right thing. What's the highest study? He's going to have to study the highest thing, right? And what's the highest study? That's the study of the good. So he says, this is at 505a, Socrates said, the idea of the good is the greatest study, the greatest mathema, the greatest subject matter, the greatest learnable, you might say, the greatest study. And the translation here is a bit odd, and the Greek's a little bit odd too, but the translation says, and it's that it's by availing oneself of it along with just things and the rest that they become useful and beneficial. I mean, the Greek actually says it's by something like by the just things and the rest making use of the good that they become useful and good. It's by using the good that they become useful and good. In any case, the point is, he's saying it is the good that is responsible for good things being good, basically. And that, good as such, is the greatest study. And that's what the philosopher is especially going to have to be focused on. So that's why this theme has come up. And now, in looking at this thing about illumination and so on, we have talked about the good as ultimately kind of the first principle of reality. And in fact, it's a word that even goes beyond reality, because it's what is responsible for there being reality, right? So he says it's beyond being, right? So really we're saying like that's, he's saying that if you really want to understand reality, you have to understand that the good is what explains it. The reality is about good. Right? But now, before we can pursue that a bit more too. But before we get to that, I want to read you one more thing, and that is where this stands with respect to you. And here, I think the point is to be oriented towards the. Well, I've talked before about the way the human soul is in a way oriented towards reality. Not just that it's oriented towards food, like, every cat is oriented towards food, and food is real. But the cat isn't oriented towards reality, not as such. It's oriented towards getting something to eat. And we, looking on, could say, well, that's a bit of reality that's happening there, and that's true. But the cat isn't, the theme of reality isn't alive to the cat, as far as I can tell. But for us it is. So that's what I mean when I say we're oriented towards reality. Not just that we do things and they happen to be real, but that the issue of reality, what it is to be real, is alive and meaningful for us. And that's where we began with the whole study of the pre-Socratics, right? Well, now he's going to say that basic thing about the good. In a crucial way, our very nature is to be intrinsically oriented towards the good. So he says at 505D, the very end of D, right before E, he says, now this is what every soul pursues, and it's that for the sake of which it does everything, the good. So he's saying, it's not that you might or might not be interested in the good. The very nature of the kind of thing you are is that you care about the good. But he's sort of saying that to get you to notice that. In other words, you don't have to have someone tell you what the good is exactly, because you want the good, at least the minimal sense that you want what's good for you. Right? There's a grasp of the meaning of good that can't be removed from your experience. There isn't anybody who hasn't had that, some sense of good, right? The simple fact that the good is alive for us doesn't mean we have a deep and profound relationship to it. But the point is, nobody can not have a relationship to it. Right? What that means is once you're involved in that relationship, you can also ask, what is the good? Right? That was the point I was making before. Whenever something is kind of illuminating your experience, that thing becomes an issue you can now turn to and think about. Right? Anyway, so he says, the soul divines, like it's like he's almost like saying, like, we might in our more idiomatic way say intuits, like you kind of have a sense that it's there. It divines that it is something, but it divines it in the sense that you don't have a direct knowledge of it. You kind of get it in a way you don't really even know, right? The soul divines that it is something, but it is at a loss about it, the good, and it's unable to get a sufficient grasp of just what it is, or to have a stable trust such that it has about the rest of things, like about everything else. Like you feel confident, you trust that there's a table in front of you, you trust that food's going to fill you up. It doesn't mean you always place your trust rightly, but that is the nature of our experience, that there's a kind of trust inherent to our perceptual and behavioral life, that like we live with an unquestioned faith most of the time, except in probably moments of crisis and so on. But typically we live with an unquestioned faith that these things are real and I know what they are. We have a sense of the good, and even if it's not just trying to do what's good for ourselves, even if we want to do what's right in that more moral sense, I want to do a good thing. We have a sense of what it is, but we don't immediately know how to figure that out. And if someone says like, well, what is the good? What is this moral imperative? You're kind of like, I have a sense that it's there, but I couldn't exactly prove it. I couldn't exactly show it to you, right? So it seems to me like he's saying like you have this sense of a good as something that you sort of have to answer to, but you don't exactly know what it is, and it seems comparatively thin and obscure in contrast to the rich and obvious concreteness of these things around us that we have a kind of trust in. He's ultimately aiming to show that the relationship should be reversed, right? That it's really the good that in a way we can be most sure of, and the very way we relate to these things is often the thing that's kind of distorted and misleading. Anyway, I wanted just to read that one part just to get that first idea that it's that every soul is already oriented to, and we kind of divine the nature of it, but we don't really notice it. We don't really know it. We don't have a sufficient grasp of it. So what I've tried to do here then is a few things in this last little part. I picked up that notion of illumination and took it through that remark about seeing and so on, and then read these remarks when he said the good kind of illuminates everything. And then I just brought that back to the other thing that was leading up to that, which is the discussion of the philosopher who in the most precise sense would be the guardian in the most precise sense. And the idea there was that person would have to study the good. And so we remarked that the good is the greatest study, and we kind of already know why because of that other thing I said. But then I wanted to bring out this other remark that there's a way in which we're kind of innately attuned to it, even if we don't have precise and exact knowledge of it. So let's carry on with the next and the final section of Book 6. So just remember then, in sight, there's a relationship between seer and seen that depends upon illumination. It depends upon light, and in particular then it depends upon the sun, but light in general. And there's an analogous relationship at the level of knowing. There's a relationship of knower and known that depends upon a kind of illumination by the good. Now, he hasn't really explained exactly what that means yet. He's said it as a kind of provocative notion, and I hope you're thinking about it. But I'm going to try to say something about what I think that might mean in a few minutes. But put that aside for now. So what I really want you to do is just to hold on to those, the analogy between those two relationships. And so that's what he says at 509D. He says, well, then I said, conceive that as we say these two things are, one is the king of the intelligible class and region, that'd be the good, while the other is the king of the visible. Clear enough. So picking up from there, then he says, okay, so now let's talk about those two realms we've marked out, the intelligible and the visible, the realm of knowing, sort of properly speaking, or the realm of noein, nous, that I was talking about, and the realm of sensing, or well, vision is the particular example he gives here. I think we could talk about sensory or perceptual life in general, more broadly, but vision is the example he's using, because as you recall, Glaucon, I think it was Glaucon, didn't recognize a third like the sun in the domain of hearing, and you might wonder if he was right or wrong about that. Anyway, but we have vision, so that's what we're talking about. Anyway, so we've got these two realms, the intelligible or the realm of noein, and the the realm of vision. And so then he says, take a line cut in two unequal segments, one for the class that is seen, and the other for the class that is intellected. The related to by nous. And then go on to cut each of those two segments again according to that same ratio. And he says, so we're going to make a line, and this divided line, it's one of the most famous images in Plato. This divided line is an image of the forms of our experience, is going to be a portrayal of a set of different ways, fundamentally different ways that we can relate to the world, what it is that we are encountering when we come into contact with what's around us. And so we're good. So he's going to go through and identify those. And he says, when we're talking, and basically he's going to say, we can discuss those things in terms of relative clarity and obscurity, and which is to say, basically in terms of relative truth and untruth. So he says, in terms of relative clarity and obscurity, we'll have one segment in the visible part for images, ikones. And he says, I mean by images first shadows, then appearances produced in water, and in all close-grained, smooth, bright things, and everything of that sort. So that's the first part. That's going to be the sort of lowest or weakest part of the line. So there's the two parts, the visible and the intelligible. Two parts in the visible, two parts in the intelligible. Before talking through all those, I just want to emphasize, I want to bring out what he says here about the first two. So as he says, the first one is images, like shadows and appearances produced in water. That's the bottommost segment. And then the other segment, put that of which this first is the likeness. So I want you to think about that. Think about shadows is the example he gives, and that's one of my favorite ones. I think it's such a helpful example. When people use this in movies, some people are sitting and talking, and suddenly all that happens is the light changes. There's a certain part of the floor that's illuminated and a certain part of the floor that's dark. But what you and the people in the movie immediately recognize is that the bad guy has appeared. Right? What did you do? You saw his shadow. But I want you then to think about what it means to see a shadow. Right? To see a shadow is, sort of at a material level, you're just seeing some display of darkness and light on a surface. But you see that display of that disposition of darkness and light as the reflection of a person. So there's nothing in darkness or the darkness or light that means that. It's just some weird physical effect. You can change the lights; it would change. That's all that's going on there. But you don't just see a dark and light surface. You see that thing as the appearing of some person, and you see because you recognize that person as the cause of it. So it's very interesting that you would recognize the presence of a person by seeing some light and dark on the ground. Right? There are other things like that. There could be sounds, and it's actually the sounds of footsteps. You don't just hear sounds; you hear them as footsteps. There's nothing intrinsic to those pitches and timbres and so on that means footsteps, but you've got used to learning about how the world works, and so there's a certain sound you hear, and you say, "Oh, that's somebody walking down the street." There's a person I live in the house with who, whenever she comes home, she puts her bike up on the porch, and I often don't hear her. I don't hear anything else, but there's a particular sound of the metal fence on the porch being banged and rattling. And as soon as I hear that, I think I immediately hear, oh, she's back home. And so I hear that sound as her return. But there's really nothing in the sound of that rattling porch that means that intrinsically. But I immediately recognize the presence of the person through that. But so the point is, to see something as a shadow, or to see something as a sort of sound shadow of a person, is to to recognize that thing as the appearing of something else, to recognize the light and dark or the sound of the vibrating metal as the appearing of a person. And so you are taking that as sort of the way some other thing shows itself, and that thing that shows itself is really the cause of it. Right? So that's the thing I'd like you to think about shadows, and that's the relevant point. Right? That when you see a shadow, you are seeing that already in terms of what you recognize to be the reality. So he says, so that's the lowermost segment of the line. And that would be the one where things are most obscure. Why? Because if you think of what is really there showing itself, that's a kind of a poor way to show itself. If you contrast seeing a person versus seeing a shadow, you would say, yeah, the shadow was the appearing of that person, but it's a pretty low grade appearance compared to sitting there talking with the person, having dinner with them, learning about their views about the world and whatever else, right? Like there are much richer and better ways the person can be presented to you. So yes, the person is presented, but the person is presenting themselves through that shadow, is presented through the shadow, but in a fairly obscure way, in a way that doesn't go very far to putting on display what the reality of that reality is. It's what it is, right? So that's the lowest at the level of clarity. And so, of course, if you see a shadow, or sometimes you can see a shadow and you know it to be a shadow, but you don't know what is a shadow, what it is a shadow of. And so you would turn around to see, because you would say something is showing itself but obscurely, and so I want to see it more clearly. So you turn to see the thing that is being shown through that shadow, right? The thing that is the cause of that shadow. So that's there. As you're moving from the shadow to the thing of which it's the shadow, you're moving from lesser clarity to greater clarity, from more obscurity to less obscurity. So let's go up to that next segment. This is the other half, or not half, but the other segment of the visible realm. So he says, then in the other segment, put that of which the first is the likeness. So, the animals around us that cast shadows, or the plants that grow and are reflected in the water, and also all kinds of artifacts, hammers and tools, basically the things that you would normally think to call things, the things of everyday life, the things of everyday perceptual experience. So it seems to me it's pretty straightforward to say, yes, those things were reflected in the shadows, and so the shadows were reflections of these, and so on, all those relationships that I said. So there we have the visible realm. There are the things that are the obvious objects of your everyday perceptual experience, and there are their reflections and shadows, and you understand that relationship. Now he says, now consider how the intelligible section would be cut. So we're going to go to the intelligible section, and we're going to cut it in two also. We'll get to that cut in a moment. The thing that I want to focus on before we do that, though, is just the move from the visible to the intelligible. So let's just begin with the first line of that next thing. So this is now at 510b. So do it like this. He says, in one part of it, a soul, or a perceiving person or whatever, using as images the things that were previously imitated, is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypothesis and makes its way not to a beginning but to an end. That's enough. And we'll continue that in a minute. The point here is he says, using as images the things that were previously imitated. Okay, so the shadow really was a kind of image of the bear, that was there, right? So the bear is in a way sort of imitated or reproduced, reenacted in dark and light in the shadow, right? So that you can there's a relationship there of this as a kind of showing of that. So this was the original, and this shadow was the image, right? But now he's saying, look at those things that were the originals of the shadows, the bear versus the shadow of the bear. And he's saying that he's actually going to move on to another point. He skips over this one pretty quickly, but let's rest on this point for a second. There is an important sense in which that bear is also an image of something else, of something more original. So what does that mean? And there, I think the point there is pretty much the point I already made about the seed. Right? When you to see something as a seed is like seeing a shadow, right? So in a shadow, you have a some disposition of darkness and light on a surface, but you see it as, you recognize it as presenting something, the person or the bear. Well, similarly, when you see a seed, there's an oval shaped bit of white, I'm thinking of an orange seed. There's an oval shaped bit of some kind of white material, but you see it as basically the presence of an orange plant, the life of an orange thing. So that an orange is present to you in that seed, just in its most undeveloped sense, right? So that's the seed is kind of an image of the life force, the life reality that is the orange, in a way that's kind of analogous to the way the shadow is an image of the bear, or maybe I could hold the orange seed up. I could put an orange seed up and it could cast a shadow. So you can imagine a shadow of an orange seed, and there you have a relationship of shadow to original. But the seed itself is kind of an image of the orange, right? It's not just that the seed is an image of the full-grown plant. The full-grown plant is just as much an image too, right? The seed is one passing facet of the way the life that is the orange manifests itself, and the full-grown plant is another way in which the life that is an orange manifests itself, and all the stages in between, etc., etc. Those are all so many changing presentations of one and the same life. But at no point do you ever see the life as such. You see something that is presenting that life to you, right? And so you grasp that living thing, and it's in light. I guess you understand it. You grasp in some kind of intellectual way, some understanding way, that there is a living thing there. And because of that, you are able to recognize what you see as a seed or a full-grown plant or whatever, right? So in other words, if you now then think of the things I was saying earlier about, and repeating here, about the orange seed and the plant and so on, and the things about the shadow and the bear or whatever, like, you can see that those are the same kind of relationship. But except that what in the shadow and bear relationship, or the shadow and natural thing, plant, animal, or artifact, was the original, you're now recognizing as playing the role of the shadow, being the shadow of something else. And that shadow, that of which it is the shadow, that something else of which it is the shadow, is not itself something you could ever see. Because whatever you see will be its shadow, right? Its trace, its way of making itself manifest perceptually, when it is itself something that is never a simple perceptual presence. It could never be that. It's something you can only grasp understandingly. Right? So in the perceptual experience of a seed, as such, you're just seeing it as a seed, you have already engaged your understanding, or your nous, or something like that. But you aren't using that noetic power. You aren't using that cognitive understanding power on its own terms or for itself. You're not recognizing it as such. You're relying on it. It's like you're inheriting it without earning it, so to speak. You're relying on it. But all you're really taking yourself to be doing is seeing, right? So that's a point that I already made, but I want to just reiterate it here, right? So, and it's the point I was saying goes all the way back to Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? That we typically misrepresent to ourselves what is going on in our experience, and take ourselves only to be directly seeing things, etc., where in fact what's going on in our perceptual life is inherently informed by deeper, I could say cognitive relationships, but I don't really like that word, because it makes it sound like something that's going on in some sort of bubble of representational consciousness. But there are some other kinds of activities of the way you or your soul or whatever relates to reality. There's some other kind of relationship between you and reality, some other kind of recognizing relationship between you and reality that has to be going on for you to have the everyday perceptual experiences that you're having. And you typically rely on that without acknowledging it. You may even disavow it. You may even, when asked, deny it. And what we've been doing all along has been trying to orient ourselves towards noticing that, right? But so that's really just the point that's being made here, or the point I'm making at this shift from the visible to the intelligible. In our everyday perceptual experiences, we have already been relying on the intelligible engagement, the intelligent relationship with intelligible reality. But we don't take it up as such. But we can make that move. And so he says, and so that's what he says here. So now let's move from. So let me actually say one more thing and then finish that. So in seeing a shadow, you might take yourself only to be responding to a sort of sensory experience, but it's not that simple, because you wouldn't see it as a shadow if you didn't see it in terms of your familiarity with the things and recognize those things as a cause. And so there's something more happening than just what's going on in the sort of material recognition of shadows and light, right? Because you're seeing it as an image. And it's only in recognizing that it is defined by the thing that you see it as a shadow. Well, and so similarly here, it's only in recognizing these sort of intelligible relationships that you can see something as a seed. So it's already happening, but we're not paying attention to it. But so now we can take that thing up in its own right. But in that case, the soul using as images the things that were previously imitated is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypotheses and make its way not to a beginning to an end. Anyway, what he's talking about here, and he makes this clear in a little bit later, is we do sometimes explicitly focus on thinking, calculating, figuring things out. So the word he used back in Book 4 when we were talking about the division of the soul was logismos for calculation. The very similar word he uses here, dianoia. But basically it means calculating, figuring things out, working things through, right? And so we do that sometimes. So let's put aside the seed example for a moment, though we can come back to that. But let's take another example. Let's go back to our Pythagorean theorem, right? I have a friend right now who's actually building something in my backyard. He's a great jazz drummer. His name's Jesse Baird, and he also happens to be great, carpenter and stuff like that. And so he's building a little work shed, and there are a lot of right angles in that. And so he's got his square out there and stuff, and he does lots of measurements and figuring angles out and so on. And so he really relies on that Pythagorean theorem. Whether or not he ever studied geometry, he probably did. But whether or not he did, like he understands for sure some things about right angles, triangles, straight lines, circles, all the relationships between them. And so when he's out there, he comes upon boards. He's got these 8-foot lengths of 2x4 spruce, let's say, that he's building the frame with. Well, he gets one of those and he treats it as if it is 8 feet long. Straight. It's not, it's kind of like, they're kind of a little bit like this always, and they're never exactly 8 feet long. But actually they always cut them a half an inch short, right? So it'd be 7.5 inches, but it's not even exactly 7.5 inches, right? You're never going to get those exact things. But for the purpose of his working things out, he treats those things as, images of mathematical, like Pythagorean realities, and then he figures out the relationships that have to hold between certain pure mathematical things. Like, so if I'm trying to make this thing square, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. He figures out, there's that dianoia word, or logismos. He figures out mathematically how this thing is supposed to be, and he uses that then to take the boards and put them in the right place, right? So he's using, so a board, which is an artifact and formerly part of a tree, could cast a shadow. So you could have a shadow of the board, but that board here, insofar as it's an artifact, is not functioning as an imitation of a tree anymore, the way a seed is an image of a tree, but it's functioning as an image of a straight line. And then he's going to make other things that are going to be an image of a square, and other things that are going to be an image of a right angle. Nothing in that wooden shed is going to be actually a straight line or a right angle or a circle. They'll be close in various ways, but they'll all fall short of being that exactly. There's no way to make any kind of physical, natural, material reality that would perfectly be one of those geometrical things. But he takes them as images of perfect mathematical realities and uses his understanding of the relationship between perfect mathematical realities to work with them to solve a problem in the world he wants to solve, which is how to build a shed. Right? So one part of the soul, using as images the things that were previously imitated, is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypotheses. The hypothesis is that if you have a right angle triangle, and if the one side is 3 inches and the other side is 4 inches, then the other one will be 5. Like, you use that as a hypothesis. If you got this and if you got this, then this is going to follow. Well, he uses those things as the hypotheses for then making its way not to a beginning but to an end, namely building a shed, making a thing of a certain shape in the material world. So he says that's now the lower level of the intelligible realm. And that is what we would call in sort of everyday life thinking or understanding, calculating, dianoia, what he says, figuring out. We do that all the time. And so most of our life is contained between seeing bears and seeds and trees and pieces of wood, right? Seeing plants and animals and artifacts, having a perceptual relationship with those, and dianoia, relying on intelligence to think about those things. We flip back and forth between those two things all the time, and those two things, I think, if I'm not mistaken, are the same size on the divided line. Right? Those are the regular places that we live. Like those are the two parts of our everyday familiarity. We flip back and forth between relating to the world as a place that you can just see, and relating to the world as a place that you have a noetic relationship with, without actually noticing that those two are different, right? Without actually noticing that, the whole thing that we've been talking about, right? That the fact that we have that noetic relationship to things, to reality, it tells us something about that perceptual world, namely that it's not the last word on things. It's not the ultimate frame of reference for understanding reality. But in everyday life, we don't really notice that. So in everyday life, we live as if trees and plants are the most real things and the most certain things. And yet we constantly dip into a fundamentally different relationship to reality without ever actually acknowledging the weight that should have for our understanding of ourselves in the world. Even in gardening, when you think about the seed as a seed and you think about what tulips need or what plants need, you've done that same thing, right? You've moved from anything perceptual to an intelligent grasp of a kind of reality that can never be perceived as such, but that we're very much familiar with, which is that life force, that life power. Remember, he talked about grasping powers. That sort of power that is the cause of things appearing the way they do. And it's sort of the reality. The life that is the tulip is the reality that's producing all these changing material forms. But they are, in a way, just its images. And none of them exhausts it. None of them is equal to it, etc., etc. So I was, I'm trying to get the mathematical and the sort of natural. I'm trying to get both of them to sort of come out to you a bit, and that should connect back with the mathematical side of things that we talked about with Pythagoras, and then the emphasis on nature that I tried to bring out of the second course of Antigone. Anyway, we are always relying on our noetic grasp of those things, but we don't exactly go on and dwell in the realm of noesis. We rely on our noetic grasp of things to figure things out about our perceptual and practical world, right? That's what he calls dianoia, right? That's this using what we grasp intellectually, what we grasp noetically, as hypotheses, or as the principles we sort of turn to work out how the world is going to work. Now, why do those things work? Well, we don't even think about that. We just accept it, right? But so he says there's a further thing you can do, and that is you can now take those noetic realities, Pythagorean theorem, the very notion of a plant, the very notion of a living thing, the very notion of a tulip, whatever. You can take those noetic realities and you can ask about them. Why are they here? What are they the image? Of what are they the presentation? What is the power or the force that shows itself in them? And so he says that's the higher level, the highest level actually, the higher level of the intelligible and the highest level of the divided line. And that's when you're reaching the greatest clarity. That's when you have turned essentially to ask about reality as such. What is the nature of reality as such that it articulates itself in these forms that we've just been talking about? So that's where he says in the other part, it makes its way to a beginning that is free from hypothesis, starting out from hypothesis, by which he means things like the Pythagorean theorem, or the notion of the very notion of a point or a line or a square or something like that. Those things which we were calling the hypotheses that we rely on when we're figuring out things about the perceptual world. Well, now we start from those things that were hypotheses, but we ignore the images that were used in the other part. Like, we don't care about the board that's a rough approximation of a straight line. We're now thinking about line as such, right? We can take those things without the images and make our inquiry through them as now the thing that is to be explained, and try to make our way back to the real beginning, that which is the source of those. That thing I just said is what he says in the next few paragraphs, because Glaucon said, wait, I didn't understand you, explain it. And so he explains that in somewhat more detail. And so then we end up with a line then that has these four parts. The lowest part that we would call is shadows, reflections of things. And so he calls that the domain of images, and or of imagination. I can see it. So he both names sort of what those things are and what our relationship to them is, right? So he calls them images. He calls it sort of imagination. But then he says the next one, where you have things, which you talked about, natural things, plants, animals, and artifacts, he calls that a relationship of pistis, or trust. And that's an interesting one. I mentioned trust before, about our sort of perceptual trust in things. It's another kind of debt, really. We sort of have a trust in these things. These things are just there. We take them for granted. I don't really know where they come from or why, but we just kind of rely on them and trust in them and so on. We just automatically are trusting that that's reality. Right? The next level, the level of the Pythagorean theorem and whatever else, he calls that, as I said, dianoia, because that's the use of these things to think through about the perceptual world. And then the highest level is what he calls noesis. That's where we are really grasping the first principles of things, the first principles of reality. Actually, that's what he says in Book 6. In Book 7, I'll just refer you to one little passage. It's Book 7, 530, the very end of 533e and then 534a. It's just a paragraph. But he says the same thing here. He names it, actually, I'm going to read it. So he names it slightly differently there. There he calls the highest level episteme, or knowledge. And then he calls the other ones the same, dianoia, pistis, and ikasia. But he calls the highest one there episteme, not noesis. And now he calls the whole of the intelligible part of the divided line noesis, and the whole of the sensible part, or the visible part of the divided line doxa, or opinion. And so, but I'm just going to read that because there's one further thing I want to bring out. We'll call the first part knowledge, episteme, with the second dianoia, that translates it as thought here. the third trust or pistis, and the fourth imagination or eikasia. And those latter two taken together, the two at the bottom in the sensible realm, opinion, doxa, and the former two, the higher level, intelligible, he calls intellection or noesis. And I just want to read this one thing after that. An opinion has to do with coming into being, and intellection has to do with being. And doxa has to do with genesis, and noesis has to do with ousia. I just want to bring up that last thing, right? That whole realm that you deal with in perceptual life, whether the direct encounter of plants and animals or of their shadows, is the realm of nature. It's the realm of things that come into being and pass away, right? So the realm of genesis, coming into being and passing away. It's always in motion. It's always changing, right? But now you recall Heraclitus saying, changing, it rests. Well, nature is on the one hand all that change, but nature is also, in a way, the unchanging essential structure of things, that all of those things are kind of imitating and acting, reenacting. And so that's what he calls ousia, or being, that which is to say the kind of eternal, the unchanging structure of reality as such. What makes reality reality? Right? Anyway, so that's then, and so the divided line then is doxa about genesis, right? Opinion about things coming into being and passing away. That's the name of what our cognitive relationships are. We basically rely on a kind of opinion. We have beliefs, trust about things that are coming to being and passing away. But then we can also have noesis, real knowing of ousia, of being, of the real structure of reality as such. In our everyday life, we actually rely on that insofar as we are always thinking about and figuring things out about the world of perception by an implicit, which is to say typically unacknowledged, reliance on the noetic grasp of ousia, of some of those realities. And we use our noetic grasp of ousia, of the structures of being, to figure things out about things in the world of coming to being and passing away. We don't spend a lot of time with shadows. It's not so big, but most of our life is spent calculating about the things we perceive and doing the perceiving. But we can also do this other thing where we try to sort of own up to what we're relying on, what we have inherited, so to speak, and we can sort of try to earn our noetic grasp by asking, okay, what is this? Where do these things come from? What is the source of them? And ask the question of reality as such, and that then takes us to the highest level of the divided line. And that when if we can answer those questions, when we really know what is being reflected in the intelligible structures we depend on, then we're going to be knowing the nature of reality. We're really going to have science in the strongest sense. That's episteme. So that's the divided line. And he's already told us that the good is in a way that ultimate first principle. So I just want to say one more thing now about what that might mean, and then I'm going to wrap up a little bit with just a look at the image of the cave from book 7. There's nowhere that I'm familiar with in Plato where that the meaning of the good being the first principle is just fully cashed out for you. So it's one of the great things you have to think about. But there are places where he says a few things, and so I want to just say a few things so you can try to make some sense of that. And the place it seems to me where you get closest to an explanation is Socrates near the end of the Phaedo, when he talks a little bit about this idea that the good would be the cause of everything. Anyway, but so I'm not going to go work through that, but I'll just say a few things quickly. When I talked about the seed, to see a seed is to see it in terms of the orange and so on. The further thing you could say there is that the seed actually has somewhere it's going to go. It's kind of got in a way, when you see something as a seed, you see it as defined by a kind of goal, which is to realize the growth and life of the plant. So there's a kind of good intrinsic to the very meaning of being an orange plant or a tomato plant or whatever. It's the good for the seed. that it is the good in the sense that it is what it pursues as a goal. It's a norm kind of intrinsic to its very being that determines what's good for it, what's not good for it, and so on. So if we already moved from the seed to the very idea of life, and thereby moved from the sensible to the intelligible, we also then identified this new kind of reality that is itself, as I was just saying, to be understood as a kind of good. And any life is in a way is a relationship to a kind of good. So there's a way you might think of the good as the thing really you need ultimately to explain how you could even have a meaning like nature. And then with respect to people, it's a little bit different, because the thing about us is that, unlike presumably the orange plant or the dog, we actually have the issue of the good raised for us. So that's because we're those noetic beings and we can grapple with sort of absolute meanings. But, and so the thing that passage I read a few pages back in book 6 was about the way that basically for every human being, the issue of the good is raised. We are the kind of being for whom it is always a meaningful question, what is good? We commonly, maybe initially, relate that to what is good for ourselves. But I guess that's already an interpretation, and even there, that notion itself, what is good for us, needs further interpretation, right? That's another thing to say, but there's a kind of obscurity that remains there, and so we as he said, every soul is essentially intrinsically constituted by a meaningful relationship to the good, and it is then an issue for us that's definitive of our very being, to grapple with that sense of what we take the good to be. And Socrates' point is that people, often don't come up with the best answers. But nonetheless, in a way, that's how you have to define a human life, right? You see it as the working out of a certain take on what the good is. So then what's really incumbent upon us as people is to raise that issue explicitly and thereby to become actually good, right? But that's how you might think about so I talked about the good in nature more broadly first, but as we saw in the second course, our relationship to the nature is kind of ambivalent. So now I've talked about it in relation to that distinctive aspect of ourselves that isn't quite the same as anything else in nature, right? And then the last thing is, I think there's a further one. The good is being presented as beyond being, and in that sense as the ultimate principle. And I guess that's because it's good that there are good things, and it's good that there is the good, and that's why there is being. That's why there is reality. Right? So I think something like that. There's a quick set of answers, right, to how you might think of the good as what's ultimately going to be the first principle explaining the natural world, how you're going to think about the good as the ultimate thing you're going to have to talk about in relationship to human life, and how you're going to have to think about the good as the ultimate thing you're going to talk about in relationship to reality as such. You can think about that on your own and so on. But those are some suggestions that I would come to from, those some ideas, proposals that I would offer that come from a lot of suggestions in these texts. I just don't want to take on the whole study here because it's a big study. But it's the greatest study, as he said. Anyway, so I want to go on now and just say a little bit about the last little bit of our reading, and that's the image of the cave from Book 7. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. I think it's pretty clear and pretty engaging. I only want to, so I'm going to quickly just say what it is, and then I want to just point to two little parts in it, and that will actually conclude our study of the Republic. But so the basic, he says, let's have an image of then. Now that we've talked about what our experience of the world is like, now that we've talked about what knowledge is like, let's have an image of that. He says an image of us basically with respect to our understanding and our ignorance, or our education and lack of education. And he says in our normal life, it's like we're prisoners in a cave. We're people who are sort of chained down in our bodies, facing a wall. And on that wall there are shadows. There are shadows that are being that are being displayed there, and they're coming from behind us, where people are walking around with puppets in front of a fire or something like that, and so these lights are these shadows are being put on the wall in front of us, and that's all we see of reality. So we're like prisoners in that cave, in that for those people who've only ever been staring forward like that, they don't know that those things are coming from people holding up puppets in front of fire. So they take this to be what the experience of the world is like, and so they relate to those shadows as if they were reality, and they can try to understand them. So they play games, like they watch, and somebody says, "Oh, look! Every time that sort of round-headed one comes by, it's followed by two pokey-headed ones, and so I bet that's always going to happen, right?" So they can learn how to guess what's coming and so on. So the interesting thing is they're seeing shadows, but they don't know that they're shadows. So they're not seeing them as shadows. They're seeing them as if they were the things that are, right? And they're trying to understand them as if the simple terms of their presentation were all you would need to understand them. But of course they're not. There's no way you can understand what's going on there unless you understand what's really happening, which is these people moving puppets back and forth. And so all the efforts these people put into using the mere terms of what's presented to them in order to try to understand what's presented to them are destined to fail, because they're pointedly not engaging with what is really the causal source of those things, right? But then he says, imagine that it happened that somebody gets dragged out of there. Somebody comes and releases one of the prisoners and pulls them up past, the people with the puppets in front of the fire, and even right out of the cave, out into daylight, where first you'd come out, and because you'd been in the dark, you don't want to get in the bright light too much, so you'd keep your eyes down, but you'd see plants and animals and rivers, and eventually you could even look up and see the sun in the sky and so on. And so he says, that's like an image of going from the shadow to what it's a shadow of, to the real things that those puppets were imitations of, to the light that's illuminating them. Like it's a kind of a roughly an analogy for an ascent up those different levels of the line. And so you can say, okay, here you're going to see what's really happening, which is sort of twice misrepresented, first in terms of puppets in front of a fire, and then in terms of just these dispositions of light and darkness on the wall, right? So there the person would finally think, oh, I used to think what was going on was however I interpreted those lights on the wall. Now I see, that person would go through a stage of saying, now I see it's these things being held up in front of fires. But once that person gets out of the cave, he or she or they is going to say, now I see that what's really going on is there are plants and animals and sunlight and so on, right? And so at that point, there's, relatively speaking, you're now getting reality, and you're seeing how distorted and misrepresentative your former views were. So then he says, that person can go back down, because you might want to go back down and try to alert some of those people to the fact that they're living in a dream, like awake, they're like dreamers, or whatever Heraclitus said, right? And why? Well, because you would do it because now you've seen the truth, and you would feel a certain kind of responsibility to go down there and try to help enlighten others and bring them out of their ignorance. Right? So anyway, that's roughly the story of the cave. I just want to draw attention to two points that he makes there. So he says, if you went out, you discover all this new stuff in the world, and you'd think, oh, this is what's really going on. So then he says, 516c, when he recalled his first home and the wisdom there, what people, the prisoners staring at the wall, took to be wisdom, which we know to be kind of ridiculous nonsense based on guesswork about something that's inadequate on its own to even show you what it is. But what they take to be wisdom. When he recalled his first home and the wisdom there, and his fellow prisoners in that time, don't you suppose he would consider himself happy for the change and pity the others, right? But then he goes on. So think back to what it's like down there. And if in that time there were among them honors and prizes and praises for the man who's sharpest at making out the things that go by, and most remembers which of them are accustomed to pass before and which after, which at the same time as others, and the man therefore who is thereby most able to divine what's going to come. If they used to give prizes for that, in your opinion, Glaucon, would the man who has now come out of the cave be desirous of those honors? Would he envy those who are honored and hold power? No, not, because now he sees that's empty. I don't want praise for something that I know to be pointless stupidity, right? So he says, if that man were to come down again now and sit in the same old seat, and he came suddenly from the sun, wouldn't his eyes get infected by the darkness? And if once more he had to compete in those games with the perceptual prisoners, in forming judgments about the shadows, before his eyes had recovered, he wouldn't be very good at it. He'd be the source of laughter, right? In other words, I don't know how good an example the darkness is, but it's fine. But I think I might have said something a little bit different. I might have said the issue is, now that he realizes it's nonsense, it's hard to see how to pretend it's sense. But in any case, if this person now coming down, who is now familiar with in a totally different world, is suddenly said, okay, you have to be familiar with this and tell us what's going to happen, like he's not going to do a very good job at playing their game. And so he's going to be the subject of laughter, as if he's a fool and an ignoramus. And people would say, oh, you went up there and you came down here with your eyes corrupted. You can't see as well as you used to. When in fact, he now sees much better, right? And so in fact, if someone tried to, after they see a person doing that, if someone else tried to release another prisoner, they'd think, no, stop that. We want to kill that person who's going to try to release another prisoner because they're going to lead that person off and it's going to get worse. He should stay down here and be wise, not go up there and be foolish. And so the point I wanted to make there is just that example, right? He talks about what he, you see these two different sort of orders of knowledge when you've actually seen what's really going on, when you haven't. But the interesting thing is, having seen the truth doesn't automatically mean you can compete very effectively with people who themselves are only oriented to thinking of things in a false and misleading way. Right? Getting insight into the truth doesn't automatically mean you can show that to someone or impress someone who him or her or themselves doesn't think according to the truth. And then it says, what's going to happen in the law court, and that should remind you of the apology. And then, so I said there were 2 points. That's one. The other point that I wanted to mention is then he talks a little bit about what real education is. And this is throughout 518, I guess, and a bit beyond that too. But there he says, so, people often imagine education to be just getting something new, whether it's information or something like that. But it's like you get something new. And he says that's not what's really at issue here. What's really at issue in education is turning yourself around so that you grasp what's already been going on in your experience. So the image of the cave gives us a kind of sort of very physical spatial model for that. This guy gets turned around and he sees the shadows and so on. But I've already been using that image before about within your experience of the beauty, turning away from your fascination with the beautiful object and turning towards the fact that you're able to have an experience of beauty and so on. And that's the kind of thing he says in general, that education is really about turning around and orienting to yourself towards what's already allowing you to have the experience you have, right? What are those powers you have inherited that let you have this world that you just trust in and that's just there for you, right? That what are those powers that you're indebted to? You can turn around, and by reflecting on yourself and your own experience and how you have dealt with the good and so on, you can change your relationship to those things. Anyway, so that's all I want to bring out here from the story of the cave, which is a really rich and exciting thing in its own right. It shows quite powerfully why, if this account of knowledge is true, it's also going to be the case that the wisest people don't automatically appear wise to the foolish people, and secondly, that it draws our attention to this real misconstrual we typically have about knowledge, as if it were primarily a matter of getting a whole bunch of new stuff, when really what it involves is you changing your relationship to yourself, to reality, to meaning, to how you live your life, mostly towards the good. So we'll leave it there, and we'll go on from there to Aristotle, but that's going to just complete then our basic study of the Republic.